On the afternoon of June 8, 1995, 3 separate tornadoes are on the ground simultaneously in the Texas Panhandle, and meteorologists with direct observational access to this event still describe what they are seeing as something they have not witnessed before or since. The specific language they use 30 years later is worth noting. Off the chart is the phrase that appears repeatedly in retrospective accounts of the atmospheric conditions. Dream chase is how veteran storm chasers in the community describe the day when they are explaining why it is still discussed at chaser conventions and meteorology conferences 3 decades later. Top 10 Chase Day is the specific ranking that multiple experienced researchers who were present have assigned it in the informal accounting that the storm chasing community keeps of its most significant events. One chaser who documented the Kellerville tornado on video described it as probably the most intense tornado I have ever witnessed. A statement made by someone who had witnessed dozens of violent tornadoes across decades in the field. A formal academic analysis of the event, published 7 years afterward in the Monthly Weather Review, produced findings about cyclic tornadogenesis, the specific process by which a single supercell thunderstorm repeatedly generates and drops tornadoes in sequence. That restructured how tornado researchers think about the relationship between a parent storm and the circulations it produces. The public does not know this day exists. There is no anniversary coverage in mainstream media. There are no retrospective documentaries on the major weather networks when June 8 comes around. There is no entry in the cultural memory of American weather disasters that corresponds to June 8, 1995. No place in the standard curriculum of Texas history education. No town that rebuilds every year and marks the date with memorial services. No surviving family members who give interviews on the 40th anniversary, because there were no deaths, and therefore no grieving survivors. June 8, 1995 sits in the record books with a specific and unremarkable notation. 29 tornadoes, 0 deaths, 11 injuries, $30 million in damage. These numbers, taken at face value, describe an ordinary severe weather day in the central United States. Unpleasant, expensive, consequential, but not catastrophic. They do not describe what actually happened. What actually happened on June 8, 1995 in the Texas Panhandle is one of the most scientifically significant severe weather events of the late 20th century. At least 3 of the tornadoes that formed that afternoon were violent enough that formally credentialed atmospheric scientists who surveyed the damage paths afterward assigned them F5 ratings. The maximum category on the original Fujita scale, reserved for winds above 261 miles per hour, and the specific damage evidence that only winds of that speed produce, despite the official National Weather Service rating of F4 for all 3. The controversy over those ratings has never been resolved. The paper trail of the disagreement is in the peer-reviewed literature, available to anyone who looks for it. And the reason the official ratings say F4 rather than F5, and the reason 29 tornadoes killed no one, and the reason this extraordinary day sits in the cultural blind spot while meteorologists who were there can recall it in specific detail without prompting, is geography. The Texas Panhandle is one of the most sparsely populated landscapes in North America. The most violent tornadoes of June 8, 1995 tracked across open wheat fields and ranch land, over county roads, through small towns with populations of a few hundred people. The destruction they left behind was measured in stripped asphalt, scoured vegetation, and peeled roadbeds, evidence of extreme wind speed that the Fujita scale's damage indicators could not fully translate into a number, because there were not enough structures in the path to provide the damage indicators the scale was built to use. The worst tornadoes found nowhere to reveal themselves except to the chasers who were watching and the scientists who surveyed the aftermath. 60 miles south of the Kellerville tornado's track, Amarillo, Texas, had a population of approximately 165,000 people in 1995. The tornado did not go there. The tornado went where it went, which was east of Kellerville and across the farmland of Wheeler County, and it produced damage evidence that two of the most respected tornado researchers in the world assessed as F5, and it killed no one. This is the story of June 8, 1995, not the deadliest day in Texas weather history. Something more difficult to explain. A day on which the most violent tornadoes that Texas produced in a generation tracked through an almost entirely empty landscape were studied in real time by one of the most important scientific field programs in the history of tornado research, produced a body of data that changed what atmospheric science knows about how supercell thunderstorms generate tornado after tornado in sequence, and left the public with almost no record of their passing. If this kind of deep real science holds your attention, take a second to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps. Nobody remembers. Meteorologists never forgot. Let's begin. The Texas Panhandle is a specific kind of American landscape. It is the rectangular strip of Texas that sits north of the body of the state, wedged between Oklahoma to the east and New Mexico to the west, a flat expanse of shortgrass prairie and cultivated wheat fields and rangeland running 176 miles east to west and 120 miles north to south. Amarillo anchors the region as its only substantial city. The rest of the Panhandle is organized around small towns: Pampa, Canadian, Shamrock, Wellington, McLean, Clarendon, each serving the agricultural economy of its surrounding county with a grain elevator, a feed store, a few businesses along the main street, and a population that in most cases does not exceed a few thousand people. The population density of the Panhandle outside Amarillo is among the lowest of any comparably sized area in the contiguous United States. Driving across it on a summer afternoon, you can see weather systems approaching from 50 miles away, because there is nothing in the intermediate distance to interrupt the view. The sky is not just large. In the Panhandle, the sky is most of what exists. This geography has a specific relationship with tornado disasters that is both protective and scientifically obscuring. Protective because a tornado that tracks across the open Panhandle is more likely to encounter wheat fields than people. Scientifically obscuring because a tornado that tracks across open country leaves a damage path that the standard tools of tornado intensity assessment, the Fujita scale, and its enhanced Fujita successor, have difficulty rating accurately. The Fujita scale was designed for populated landscapes. Its damage indicators, the specific structural patterns that correspond to each wind speed range, require human-built structures to exist in the tornado's path. A residential structure swept clean from its foundation is an F4 or F5 indicator. A reinforced masonry building with exterior walls collapsed is an F3 indicator. A frame house with roof damage and broken windows is an F1 or F2 indicator. In the open Panhandle, what is present is not residential structures and reinforced masonry buildings. What is present is wheat, fence posts, telephone poles, the occasional farm structure that provides limited and imprecise information about the wind speeds that hit it, because farm structures are not built to any design standard that the Fujita scale's damage indicator calibrations were based on. This means that a tornado that tracks across the Texas Panhandle and strips asphalt from roads and scours vegetation from fields and peels bark from telephone poles has produced specific and dramatic physical evidence of extreme wind speed. Evidence that any experienced damage surveyor reading it in context understands as the signature of very high winds, and the scale will rate it at F4, because F4 is the highest rating that the available physical evidence formally supports. The most violent tornado in the Panhandle may be the most poorly rated tornado in the record, precisely because it found nowhere to reveal itself except in the few indicator objects that the Panhandle provides, and those objects do not offer the resolution to distinguish F4 from F5 with the confidence the rating framework requires. This is the specific context within which June 8, 1995 must be understood. By the morning of June 8, 1995, the meteorologists monitoring the atmospheric conditions across the southern Great Plains are looking at measurements that, in the language of operational severe weather forecasting, are extraordinary. The dew point temperatures across the eastern Texas Panhandle, the specific measure of atmospheric moisture content. The variable that determines how much water vapor is available to fuel developing thunderstorms are running in the mid-70s Fahrenheit. A dew point of 75 F in the Texas Panhandle in early June is not routine. The eastern Panhandle is not coastal territory. It does not typically receive the kind of Gulf moisture that characterizes the atmosphere along the southern Texas coast, or the humid subtropical climate of Houston. Mid-70s dew points in the Panhandle in June represent a specific atmospheric situation in which the Gulf of Mexico has pushed extraordinary amounts of moisture anomalously far north and west, pooling warm. Moist air against the dry line, the boundary between moist Gulf air to the east and the drier continental air to the west, at a location and in a quantity that creates specific thermodynamic consequences for any thunderstorm that initiates along it. The convective available potential energy, CAPE, that this moisture loading produces, combined with the temperatures in the mid to upper atmosphere and the specific vertical temperature profile of the June 8 environment, exceeds 5,000 joules per kilogram. This number requires context. CAPE is the measure of how much energy is available in an air mass for the development of convective storms, the higher the CAPE. The more violently an air parcel that begins ascending will continue to accelerate upward, and the more powerful the resulting thunderstorm's updraft. The updraft is the engine of the supercell thunderstorm. Its strength determines how much precipitation the storm can suspend, how much energy it can extract from the surrounding atmosphere, and how efficiently it can maintain and intensify the rotating column of air that becomes a tornado. Moderate severe weather days in the southern Great Plains might have CAPE values of 1,500 to 2,500 jkg. High-end days, days that produce significant tornadoes and generate considerable attention in the operational and research meteorology community, might reach 3,000 to 4,000 jkg. Values exceeding 5,000 jkg are rare enough that experienced meteorologists note them specifically, because the updraft velocities they support can sustain tornado circulations of an intensity and duration that lower CAPE environments cannot. The CAPE is not the only relevant parameter. Wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with altitude, is the other critical ingredient. The hodograph, the diagram that represents the three-dimensional wind profile of the atmosphere by plotting wind vectors at each altitude, tells atmospheric scientists how effectively the vertical wind change will organize a developing thunderstorm into the rotating updraft structure of a supercell. On June 8, the hodograph over the Texas Panhandle shows a large curved shape, indicating both substantial wind shear across the troposphere and, specifically, significant directional change in the low levels. The curvature of the hodograph at low levels is particularly important for tornado production because it correlates with the generation of low-level horizontal vorticity that the supercell's updraft can then tilt into the vertical and stretch to produce the rotating column that precedes and produces a tornado. On June 8, 1995, the hodograph is large and highly curved. The atmosphere is loaded for supercell development, specifically loaded for tornadic supercells, and specifically loaded in the direction of high efficiency and maximum intensity. The specific phrase that chaser and atmospheric scientist Tony Laubach used in his retrospective account of the forecast and chase is, "Instability was nearly off the chart." Alan Moeller, one of the most experienced storm chasers and tornado researchers of his generation, described the setup in similar terms. The numbers pointed toward an extraordinary severe weather day before a single cloud had formed. The question was not whether the day would produce violent tornadoes. The question was where the dry line would initiate convection, and what direction the resulting supercells would move, and which communities would be directly in the path of what the atmosphere was preparing to do. By early afternoon, storms initiate along the dry line in the eastern Texas Panhandle. Several supercells begin to organize. The dry line is the trigger. The cape is the fuel. The shear is the organizing mechanism. And the specific geography of the Panhandle, the flat terrain with no obstacles to the low-level wind flow, the unobstructed view of the developing storms from dozens of miles in every direction, makes the afternoon's events visible to every storm chaser who has assembled in the region. There are a lot of chasers. The VORTEX project is in the field. VORTEX, Verification of the Origins of Rotation in Tornadoes experiment, was the most ambitious scientific field program in the history of tornado research when it launched in 1994. The project's objective was specific and fundamental: to collect the data needed to understand how tornadoes form. Why does one supercell thunderstorm produce a long-track violent tornado, while an apparently similar storm produces nothing? What are the specific atmospheric conditions at the specific scales of space and time that matter for tornado formation, that determine whether a rotating updraft generates a tornado at the surface? These questions had been studied theoretically and computationally for decades, but the critical observational data, measurements of the actual three-dimensional wind field, temperature, and moisture distributions in the regions of supercells where tornadoes form, had never been assembled with sufficient density and coverage to answer them definitively. VORTEX was built to assemble that data. The project deployed a coordinated network of instrumented vehicles, weather balloons released at frequent intervals to measure the atmospheric profile around the storm, portable Doppler radars that could be positioned close to developing supercells to capture the small-scale wind detail that the fixed NEXRAD network could not resolve, and surface weather stations that measured the near-ground environment in the storm's inflow and outflow regions. All of these instruments had to be coordinated in real time, while the supercell was moving and evolving by a fleet of vehicles and researchers communicating by radio and making constant judgment calls about positioning, safety, and instrument deployment. The principal investigators of VORTEX included some of the most distinguished names in tornado research of the 1990s. Erik Rasmussen, who led the project scientifically, and researchers including Howard Bluestein of the University of Oklahoma, whose mobile Doppler radar program, the first systematic use of truck-mounted Doppler radar units for close-range tornado observation, had already produced foundational datasets on tornado structure and wind speeds The field team included veteran storm chasers with extensive experience who served as the navigators, drivers, and situational awareness managers that the scientific data collection required. Alan Moeller, a National Weather Service forecaster in Fort Worth who was one of the most scientifically credentialed storm chasers of his generation, was part of the VORTEX team. Chuck Doswell, a research meteorologist whose work on severe weather forecasting had been foundational to the field, was another. In 1995, the second and final year of VORTEX operations, the project achieved several of its most scientifically significant data collection events, including the famous Dimmitt, Texas tornado on June 2, 1995. The Dimmitt tornado is one of the most thoroughly observed tornadoes in history, with VORTEX data collection that has been analyzed and cited extensively in the subsequent literature. But June 2 was not June 8. 6 days after Dimmitt, VORTEX was back in the field for an atmospheric setup that the morning's data suggested would rival or exceed what Dimmitt had offered. The VORTEX fleet's June 8 experience reflects the specific challenge of field science in an environment where the target, the supercell and its tornadoes, is making its own decisions, and the researchers must make real-time forecasting and positioning choices that cannot be undone once committed. The project initially targeted a different storm than the one that produced the most significant tornadoes, and VORTEX consequently arrived at the Kellerville supercell after it had already reached peak intensity. The VORTEX team caught the Kellerville tornado in its later phase and the Allison tornado with better coverage. The data they collected, combined with the data from independent chasers who had caught the full life cycle of the storms, was analyzed by Dowell and Bluestein over the following years and published in the Monthly Weather Review in 2002. Not everything goes according to plan, but the data that VORTEX collected on June 8, 1995, even in its incomplete form relative to the project's objectives, contributed materially to the understanding of cyclic tornadogenesis that the Dowell and Bluestein paper represents. The Pampa supercell alone, one cyclic thunderstorm, reorganizing and rewinding its circulation repeatedly, produced at least 8 tornadoes over the course of its lifespan, not 8 tornadoes in the Panhandle that day. 8 tornadoes from one storm, from a single rotating updraft that initiated south-southwest of Pampa and eventually tracked toward Canadian, producing a new tornado circulation each time its previous one dissipated. Thomas Grazoulis, the historian of significant U.S. tornadoes whose reference works, constitute the standard record of American tornado history. Documented in Significant Tornadoes that the Pampa supercell's first tornado touched down 8 miles south-southwest of Pampa, and that the last tornado produced by the same storm dissipated 18 miles west-northwest of Canadian. 8 separate circulations sequentially generated and dissipated from a single parent storm across a track that covered dozens of miles of the Texas Panhandle. This is cyclic tornadogenesis in operational action, the process that the Dowell and Bluestein paper would analyze in detail from the McLean supercell's data, but that the Pampa supercell also demonstrated independently on the same afternoon. The second tornado produced by the Pampa supercell, the most destructive, formed at approximately 4:27 p.m. CDT near the town center of Pampa, Texas. Storm chasers watching it described its shape as a drill bit, a narrow, tightly wound, visually compact vortex, whose specific rotational structure the chasing community uses as a descriptor for a particular class of intense but relatively small tornado. The tornado tracked southwest into the industrial district of the city, where warehouses and commercial buildings absorbed the F4 winds. Vehicles were lifted and displaced. Industrial structures were torn apart. 7 people were injured. No one died. $30 million in damage. 7 injured, 0 dead. The reason Pampa produced 7 injuries rather than many more involves the specific track through the industrial district rather than densely populated residential neighborhoods, the warning that residents had received, and the specific decisions the population made in the minutes between warning and arrival. The Pampa tornado is a case study in how the variables that determine tornado fatality operate simultaneously: storm intensity, track geometry, warning lead time, and population response all intersecting in specific ways that produce specific outcomes. Here, they intersected to produce 7 injuries and 0 deaths from an F4 tornado in a city of 17,000 people. The Pampa tornado itself, the second and most destructive product of the Pampa supercell, formed at approximately 4:27 p.m. CET near the town center of Pampa, Texas. The storm chasers watching it described its shape as a drill bit, a narrow, tightly wound vortex with a specific rotational structure that produces extreme ground-level wind speeds within a relatively confined area. The tornado tracked southwest into the industrial district of the city, where warehouses and commercial buildings absorbed the violence of winds that the National Weather Service Damage Survey assessed as F4, between 207 and 260 miles per hour. Vehicles were lifted from the ground. Industrial structures were torn apart. 7 people were injured. No one died. $30 million in damage. 7 injured. 0 dead. In a city. But Pampa was not the most violent tornado of June 8, 1995. Pampa was the tornado that hit a town. The tornadoes that hit nothing but open country were more violent still, and their violence is documented in stripped roads and scoured fields rather than in the structural damage evidence that produces high ratings and cultural memory. The broader context of June 8 within the 1995 VORTEX season adds another dimension to the day's significance. June 2, 1995, 6 days before the Panhandle outbreak, the VORTEX project had documented the Dimmitt, Texas tornado, which became one of the most thoroughly observed tornadoes in history and has been cited extensively in the subsequent research literature as a foundational observational dataset. The 1995 VORTEX season produced 2 landmark tornado documentation events within 6 days of each other. The Dimmitt event is the one that appears in the research literature more frequently as the named reference point for VORTEX's contributions. The June 8 event is the one that is remembered among chasers as the Dream Chase. The difference between how these 2 events are recalled within the community and outside, it reflects the specific mechanisms by which scientific significance and public significance diverge. The Dimmitt tornado, while visually documented, was a relatively modest tornado in terms of intensity and damage. Its scientific value lay in the completeness of the VORTEX instrument network deployed around it. The June 8 tornadoes were vastly more violent, potentially F5 by expert assessment, but were less completely instrumented because VORTEX initially targeted a different storm. The public knows neither event. The scientific community knows both, for different reasons in different ways. The Kellerville tornado formed later in the afternoon from a different supercell. The storm that the chasing community calls the Kellerville storm. A cyclic supercell that produced multiple tornadoes across a long path through Wheeler County in the eastern Texas Panhandle. When this storm produced what would become its most significant tornado, the chasers who were watching it, including experienced meteorologists and researchers who had seen hundreds of tornadoes, were using language reserved for the most extreme events in their experience. One chaser who documented the Kellerville tornado described it as probably the most intense tornado I have ever witnessed. Another described a violent multiple vortex tornado that morphed into a stovepipe as it crossed Highway 273, simultaneously scouring the asphalt from the road surface. The VORTEX project, arriving after having targeted a different storm initially, documented the Kellerville tornado's peak intensity and noted, in the formal post-event assessment, extreme vegetation damage and ground scouring along its path. The Kellerville tornado tracked approximately 30 miles. At its maximum width, it was approximately 1 mile across. These dimensions are notable for any significant tornado. What made the Kellerville tornado's documentation specifically important and specifically controversial is what it left behind on the landscape it traversed. In several locations along the Kellerville tornado's path, the tornado stripped the asphalt pavement from farm to market roads. The road surface, hot mix asphalt bonded to the road base beneath it, attached by weight and by the specific adhesion between asphalt and aggregate and soil, was removed entirely, not cracked, not displaced. Stripped, the road base beneath was exposed as if sanded down by a tool moving across its surface at extreme velocity. The process that removed asphalt from road surfaces in the Kellerville tornado's path is the same aerodynamic scouring process that the El Reno tornado demonstrated in 2013, and that the 1997 Jarrell, Texas F5 demonstrated in extreme form when it removed 18 inches of soil from the subdivision it destroyed. Asphalt stripping requires wind forces beyond what the F4 rating implies. It has been documented in F5 events. It was documented here, along the Kellerville tornado's path in the Texas Panhandle in 1995. The tornado scoured vegetation along its path, removing grass and small plants from the soil, stripping the ground covering from the land surface over a width and distance that the chaser accounts and the vortex damage documentation describe as consistent with extreme wind speeds. The cumulative physical evidence along the Kellerville tornado's path is one that experienced damage survey personnel recognized as the signature of extreme winds in a category that the damage indicators available in the open panhandle landscape could not formally assign with the precision that the Fujita scale requires, but that the physical evidence strongly implied. Howard Bluestein of the University of Oklahoma, one of the most distinguished tornado researchers in the United States, examined the Kellerville tornado's damage evidence with Robin Wakimoto of UCLA. Both concluded the tornado had reached F5 intensity. The National Weather Service Damage Survey, working from the available damage indicators in the sparsely developed landscape of Wheeler County, assigned the Kellerville tornado an F4. This disagreement between the formally published National Weather Service rating and the assessment from two of the most credentialed names in tornado research has never been resolved. It sits documented in the Wikipedia article on disagreements over tornado intensity ratings, alongside other events where the physics of what happened exceeded the assessment tool's ability to formally confirm it. The evidence that would settle it definitively does not exist, because the evidence required a specific pattern of structural damage to a specific type of well-constructed building in the tornado's maximum intensity zone was never present in that section of Wheeler County. Because the tornado's maximum intensity zone passed over farm roads and wheat fields rather than buildings. The Allison tornado formed after the Kellerville tornado dissipated from the same cyclic supercell, which reorganized its circulation and produced a second major tornado in what researchers studying this event have described as a textbook case of the cyclic tornadogenesis process. Where the Kellerville tornado was approximately 1 mile wide at its maximum, the Allison tornado was nearly 1. 5 miles in diameter, 1.5 miles across. Witnesses and researchers described it in the accounts of the period as one of the largest tornadoes in history, an assessment that in 1995, before the 2.6-mile El Reno tornado of 2013, established a new benchmark for width, held specific meaning. It was officially rated F4. Its physical evidence was assessed by researchers as consistent with F5 intensity. It tracked across farmland and ranchland. The Allison tornado killed no one. The Hoover tornado, part of the Pampa supercell's family of 8 tornadoes rated F2, also stripped asphalt from farm to market roads. An F2 rating corresponds to estimated wind speeds of 113 to 157 miles per hour. The asphalt stripping documented along the Hoover tornado's path is not consistent with F2 wind speeds. Asphalt stripping is not a standard F2 damage indicator. The Hoover tornado's F2 rating is, like the Kellerville and Allison F4 ratings, a product of the damage indicator framework operating in a landscape where the specific damage indicators the scale requires for higher ratings were not present. The physical evidence said one thing. The formal ratings said another. The scientific paper that the June 8, 1995 outbreak produced, the 8 June 1995 McLean. Texas Storm, Part 1. Observations of Cyclic Tornadogenesis, published by David Dowell and Howard Bluestein in the Monthly Weather Review in November 2002, represents the outcome of 7 years of analysis of the data that VORTEX and the storm chasers who documented the event assembled on that afternoon. The paper's specific contribution to tornado science is its documentation of the cyclic tornadogenesis process in the McLean supercell, the mechanism by which the storm repeatedly generated, maintained, and dissipated tornado circulations in sequence. Cyclic tornadogenesis is the process by which a single supercell thunderstorm produces multiple tornadoes in sequence over its lifespan. Not by spawning several simultaneous tornadoes, but by generating one tornado, weakening and dissipating that circulation, and then reorganizing to generate a second tornado along the same storm track. The process was theorized before the 1995 VORTEX data. The specific mechanism, the way in which the storm's internal dynamics reset after a tornado dissipates, and the conditions under which the reset leads to a second tornado rather than to the storm simply continuing without a tornado, was not fully understood. The Dowell and Bluestein paper addresses this mechanism using the multi-platform dataset from June 8. The McLean supercell, the storm that produced the Kellerville and Allison tornadoes, among others, provided a specific and detailed observational record of the cyclic process in a high Cape environment. The data showed the evolution of the storm's surface circulation before, during, and after each tornado, capturing the specific temporal sequence of boundary interactions, downdraft reorganization, and inflow modification that preceded each new tornadogenesis event. Cyclic tornadogenesis matters for warning science in a specific and practical way that the research paper's technical content translates directly into public safety implications. If a supercell can generate one tornado, weaken its circulation, and then reorganize to produce a second and third and fourth tornado along its track, then the dissipation of one tornado from that supercell is not a signal that the threat is over. It is potentially a signal that the threat is in the process of resetting. The standard logic of tornado warnings: warn for the tornado that has been identified, issue an update when that tornado dissipates, allow the public to relax when the immediate threat appears past, is specifically inadequate for the cyclic supercell, because the next tornado may form within minutes of the first one's dissipation, and the most dangerous period may be not the first tornado, but the second. which forms when people have just heard that the first tornado is gone and are beginning to think the emergency is over. The Pampa supercell's 8 tornado production on June 8 is a specific and extreme case of this cycle operating in an unusually high Cape environment. 8 sequential tornado circulations from one storm over its lifespan, with gaps between them during which a person listening to weather radio or watching a local broadcast might have concluded that the situation was improving. The specific challenge of warning and managing public response to a cyclic supercell, communicating that the storm is still dangerous even after a tornado dissipates, maintaining public vigilance through multiple cycles of apparent threat and apparent relaxation, is one of the operational problems that the VORTEX data and the subsequent research it produced contributed to defining and eventually addressing in NW's warning communication practices. The June 8 data also contributed to tornado science's understanding of what extreme Cape environments, the 5,000+ JKG setups that are rare but not unprecedented in the southern Great Plains, due to supercell structure and tornado behavior. The combination of extreme instability with large hodograph curvature is a setup that produces supercells capable of generating long-track violent tornadoes, and the June 8 outbreak provided specific observational data about how supercells behave in this regime. The subtlety of the atmospheric signals that preceded June 8, described by one atmospheric scientist as a day where the conventional warning indicators were not as extreme as one might expect for the tornado production that resulted, contributed to subsequent research on how to better identify the specific environmental conditions that support extreme tornado events even when the standard forecasting parameters are not at their most dramatic. The lesson, Cape, matters. High Cape can compensate for other missing ingredients in ways that forecasters who rely on the full checklist of ingredients may underestimate. The Fujita scale rating controversy that June 8, 1995 generated has a legacy that extends beyond the specific storms it affected. The rating dispute over Kellerville and Allison is among the documented cases that informed the development of the enhanced Fujita scale, which replaced the original Fujita scale for U.S. tornado rating in 2007. The F scale was developed in part because of the recognized limitations of the original scale in situations exactly like June 8, 1995, where a tornado tracked through terrain with insufficient damage indicators to support a precise rating, where the available physical evidence was consistent with higher wind speeds than the scale's damage indicator framework could formally confirm, and where the gap between what experienced researchers assessed and what the formal rating assigned was embarrassingly wide. The original Fujita scale, created by Dr. Ted Fujita of the University of Chicago in 1971, was a damage-based scale from the beginning. Fujita designed it as a practical field tool for after-the-fact assessment of tornado intensity from the damage patterns left on structures and the landscape. Its categories corresponded to estimated wind speed ranges, but the wind speeds were inferred from the damage rather than measured directly. The specific damage indicators Fujita used were derived from his observations of tornado damage in the populated areas where most tornado research had been conducted, in the Great Plains and Midwest, where the density of residential and commercial structures provided numerous examples of each category's characteristic damage pattern. In the open Panhandle, this observational basis breaks down. The specific damage indicators that the Fujita scale uses to distinguish F4 from F5, complete destruction of well-constructed homes, reinforced concrete structures significantly damaged, require well-constructed homes and reinforced concrete structures to be present in the tornado's path. In the wheat fields and ranch land of Wheeler County, Texas, what is present is asphalt roads, wooden fence posts, telephone poles, and the occasional farm structure. These are the damage indicators available, and they yield wind speed estimates that do not extend with confidence into the F5 range even when the physical evidence of ground scouring and asphalt stripping suggests that the winds exceeded F4 thresholds. The enhanced Fujita scale addressed this problem through a more structured system of 28 specific damage indicators with detailed descriptions of the degrees of damage corresponding to different wind speed ranges. The F-scale's expansion of the damage indicator list was specifically intended to improve rating consistency in situations where the previous scale had been applied inconsistently, where the same degree of physical evidence had received different ratings depending on the surveyor and the available indicators. The June 8, 1995 cases, among others, provided the specific evidence of the original scale's limitations that motivated the F-scale's development. Whether the Kellerville and Allison tornadoes would be rated EF4 or EF5 under the enhanced Fujita scale, applied today, is a question that the existing evidence cannot definitively answer. The F-scale's EF5 criteria still require specific damage indicators, the degree of structural removal from well-constructed buildings, that were not present along these tornadoes' paths. The asphalt stripping and vegetation scouring would inform the assessment, but might not formally elevate the rating to EF5 without the structural damage evidence the scale requires. The tornadoes of June 8, 1995 remain, decades later, at the boundary of what the formal rating system can confirm, violent enough that the most experienced researchers who saw them concluded they deserved the highest rating, documented in terrain that could not provide the formal evidence required to assign it. The counterfactual geography of June 8. 1995 is not a minor footnote to the event's significance. It is perhaps the most important single fact about the day, and the one that reveals most clearly what the Texas Panhandle landscape did and did not protect that afternoon. Amarillo, Texas. Population approximately 165,000 in 1995. The largest city in the Texas Panhandle, situated where Interstate 40 and Interstate 27 intersect, anchoring the regional economy of the surrounding 14-county area. In 1995, Amarillo had a substantial downtown with mid-rise buildings, residential neighborhoods extending to its east, west, north, and south, and an active industrial and commercial sector. It was a real city, not Joplin, Missouri with 50,000 people, or Jarrell, Texas with 1,300, but a real city with real density, real buildings, real concentrations of people going about the business of a Tuesday afternoon. The Kellerville tornado, 30 miles long, 1 mile wide, F5 intensity by the assessment of Bluestein and Wakimoto, peeling asphalt from roads and scouring vegetation from the landscape, passed approximately 60 miles north of Amarillo. 60 miles is a meaningful but not enormous distance in terms of tornado tracks and the geographic variation of supercell initiation points. The dry line along which storms initiated on June 8, 1995 was positioned in the eastern Texas Panhandle, in a location that placed the first significant storms north and northeast of Amarillo. A dryline position 50 miles further south would have placed the initiation point 50 miles closer to the city. A storm initiating closer to Amarillo and moving on the same northeast to southwest track deviation that the Kellerville storm produced would not have tracked north of Amarillo. It would have tracked through it. The specific position of the June 8 dryline, the specific direction of the individual storm's motion, and the specific locations where the cyclic supercells produced their most violent tornadoes were all slightly north of Amarillo rather than through it. This is not a case where warning science or preparedness or public response made the difference between 0 deaths and a catastrophic toll. The Kellerville tornado tracked where it tracked because the storms initiated where they initiated and moved in the direction they moved. And those variables are determined by the atmospheric conditions on a given day. Conditions that operational forecasters can characterize broadly in advance, but cannot pin to a specific dryline position with 60-mile precision. If the Kellerville tornado had tracked through Amarillo, the outcome of June 8, 1995, would not be 0 deaths and 11 injuries. The outcome would have been one of the deadliest tornado events in Texas history, in a city large enough to be nationally prominent, on a day when a potentially F5 tornado tracked through a city for the first time in the modern era. June 8, 1995 would have entered the cultural memory of American weather disasters alongside Waco and Wichita Falls and Joplin. Texas school children would know the date. The 1947 Glazier-Higgins-Woodward outbreak that killed 68 people in similar terrain would have been overshadowed. Instead, June 8, 1995 passed through Wheeler County and Robertson County and Roberts County, through farmland and ranchland and county roads, and killed no one, and sat in the cultural blind spot for 30 years. While meteorologists who were there can still recall the specifics without prompting. The Texas Panhandle landscape has this specific relationship with violence. It experiences extraordinary atmospheric violence with some regularity. The 1947 outbreak that killed 68 was the worst modern instance of the Panhandle's capacity for producing extreme tornadoes. But it was not the only one. The same atmospheric configuration that produces violent tornadoes in the Panhandle produces them there partly because the Panhandle's specific terrain and geographic position make it a favorable location for supercell development and cyclic behavior in specific synoptic setups. The flat terrain provides unobstructed, low-level wind flow. The proximity to both Gulf moisture and dry continental air creates dry-lined situations that initiate convection in environments with extreme instability. The geography is, from the tornado's perspective, almost ideal. And the same geography that makes the Panhandle favorable for tornado production also makes it largely empty for the tornadoes to cross. The most violent weather in the southern Great Plains frequently visits the places where the fewest people live, and leaves behind stripped roads and scoured fields and overturned fences that no one outside the meteorological community notices, because there is no city to mourn and no casualty count to report, and no survivors to interview on the evening news. The violence is real. The absence of a body count makes it invisible. The documentary film The Chasers of Tornado Alley, produced by Martin Lisius, included footage of the June 8, 1995 tornadoes that provides visual documentation of the event for viewers who were not in the Texas Panhandle that afternoon. The footage captures what the chasers who were there describe in their retrospective accounts: large, violent, visually dramatic tornadoes tracking across open country, documented by people who had assembled specifically because the atmospheric setup that morning had told them that something extraordinary was likely to happen. That something extraordinary did happen in a place where it could be documented without killing anyone is one of the ways in which June 8, 1995 is genuinely unusual in the history of the Texas Panhandle tornado record. Violent tornadoes are not rare in the Texas Panhandle. The 1947 Glazier-Higgins-Woodward outbreak passed through the same general region and killed 68 people in Texas. The Panhandle has a deep history of tornado events that intersected with the towns and agricultural communities that are the only populated features of its landscape. June 8, 1995 was not the day the Panhandle experienced violent tornadoes for the first time. It was the day it experienced them in a specific geographic configuration that spared the populated locations, produced extraordinary scientific data, and generated a rating controversy that has outlasted the storms themselves. The meteorologists who were in the field on June 8, 1995, chasing for VORTEX, chasing independently. Working at the National Weather Service offices responsible for the Texas Panhandle, have maintained a specific and detailed memory of the day for 30 years. The accounts that circulate in the storm-chasing community, in the informal history preserved in the storm track forums, and the chase retrospectives that experienced chasers occasionally publish, are specific and consistent in their characterization. This was not a routine day. The CAPE values, the hodograph, the cyclic supercells, the scale of the tornadoes, the footage that came back, these constitute a day that the professional storm chasing and tornado research community places in a specific category of events that happened once, documented something fundamental about how the atmosphere works, and left a permanent mark on the people who saw them. The general public has no equivalent memory. There is no date in the common Texas weather vocabulary that corresponds to June 8, 1995, the way May 11, 1953 corresponds to Waco, or April 10, 1979 corresponds to Wichita Falls, or May 22, 2011 corresponds to Joplin. Days when tornadoes struck populated places and produced death tolls that burned themselves into the public consciousness. There was no city destroyed on June 8, 1995. There was no mass casualty event. There were 29 tornadoes, 0 deaths, 11 injuries, and the most violent tornado outbreak to strike the Texas Panhandle in the modern era of atmospheric science. Observed by the most capable field research program tornado science had ever assembled. The documentary film The Chasers of Tornado Alley, produced by Martin Lysius, preserved visual documentation of the June 8, 1995 tornadoes for the audience that a documentary film reaches. The footage captures what the chasers who were there describe in their retrospective accounts: large, violent, visually dramatic tornadoes tracking across open country, documented by people who had assembled specifically because the atmospheric setup that morning had told them that something extraordinary was likely to happen. That something extraordinary did happen in a place where it could be documented without killing anyone is one of the ways in which June 8, 1995 is genuinely unusual in the history of the Texas Panhandle tornado record. June 8, 1995 represents a specific kind of weather event that the cultural record was not designed to document, the extraordinarily violent event that produced no deaths and therefore left almost no public trace. The mechanism by which events enter cultural memory through fatalities. Through the specific grief and communal trauma that fatalities produce, through the news cycles that are generated by those fatalities, and the anniversary coverage that follows, was not activated on June 8, 1995, because the most violent tornadoes tracked where there were no fatalities to generate. The violence was real. The physical evidence was real. Asphalt stripped from roads, vegetation scoured from the soil, the specific ground-level signature of winds that two of the most credentialed tornado researchers in the country assessed as the maximum category on the rating scale. The public record of that violence is nearly zero, because the violence did not reach the specific threshold that cultural memory requires, a body count. This is the paradox that June 8, 1995 represents. Not that it was forgotten, it was never known. The general public never had the information that would have allowed them to remember it, because the information that would have attracted attention, the deaths, the destroyed neighborhoods, the emergency response, was not there. The scientific community knows. The storm-chasing community knows. The Quarterly Journal of Record for Atmospheric Science contains the analysis of what the cyclic supercells of June 8, 1995 revealed about tornadogenesis. The specific argument between the National Weather Service and two distinguished university researchers about whether the Kellerville tornado should have been rated F4 or F5 sits in the documented record of. Scientific disagreements that the Wikipedia article on tornado. Rating controversies maintains. The public knows nothing. Meteorologists remember everything. This is sometimes how science works. The most important observations are not always the ones that make the news. The most significant data is not always attached to the most visible events. The day that restructures the scientific understanding of how supercells cycle through tornado after tornado may be the day that tracks through empty farmland rather than through a city, producing extraordinary data and zero deaths, leaving the scientific community permanently changed, and the cultural record essentially blank. The wheat fields of Wheeler County, Texas were scoured in the summer of 1995. They recovered. The asphalt was repaved. The vegetation regrew. The VORTEX fleet drove back to Norman with data that took 7 years to fully analyze. 29 tornadoes. 0 deaths. The science was watching. Nobody else was. And yet the science that came out of that afternoon, the cyclic tornadogenesis documentation, the Cape environment research, the rating controversy that helped motivate the enhanced Fujita scale, is in the warning systems and the forecast models and the operational protocols that forecasters use today. The day that history forgot made the warnings better. The day the public never heard of is in the code of the emergency alerts that go out on the next outbreak day in the Texas Panhandle, or in Oklahoma, or in Kansas. When the atmosphere assembles the same extraordinary energy that assembled on June 8, 1995, meteorologists never forgot. The warnings remember too.